I'm excited about our next speaker. Uh, Timothy King is a writer, nonprofit professional, and the owner of Vagabond Strategies. He's worked as a community organizer in Chicago, a chief strategy officer with Sojourners, and currently serves as a consultant for the Center for Action and Contemplation. Uh, Timothy's work has been published in Christianity Today, Sojourners, and other ventures, and he has been interviewed by places like ABC, BBC, Times, CNN, and the Daily Beast. He's a graduate of North Park University with degrees in theology and philosophy. He lives with his wife Hannah in New England, and he is the writer of the book that you'll receive today, but also just an incredible guy who really we need to shout out has been so helpful to make this conference go. And I just really appreciate you and your sharing, but also just who you are. So, brother, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you for organizing this entire conference. And many thanks, I know Jason's gone now, but many thanks to Jason for sharing his story. It really does feel like anytime there is a space where someone in recovery knows that they can share their story and have that be accepted and have that be celebrated even, that is something that is good in the world that wasn't there just before. And so it was great to hear him share his story. And I too struggled with an opioid addiction and am now in recovery, and excited to be here with all of you to share a little bit of my story and also some of my process of learning about addiction. And because it was spurred through my own personal experience that led me on a journey of realizing how many things I had gotten wrong. And one thing, excited to be able to connect with you all, and just here at the beginning of the talk would be great to hear where people are from if you want to drop that in the chat. And another thing is, normally if we would be in person, there's a lot more time to connect with each other. So it's good if you guys get a chance to see where other people are coming from. And also right now, I'm going to drop my email address into the chat. This is my personal email. I love to connect with people who are doing this kind of work. And if there's ways that I can be helpful or be a resource to the work that you are doing, please do feel free to reach out. And that is where this is something that I didn't expect to be writing about addiction, in large part because of the stigma that surrounds it. I often refer to my story as one of early detection, so there wasn't a deep slide into issues with the criminal justice system or anything like that. But it was a story that I could have kept quiet. Not many people knew, not many people had heard about it. But it was of seeing what was around me and seeing the misconceptions about what it means to struggle with addiction and those who do struggle with addiction. But especially glad to be here at a higher education group and with any professors who are putting together syllabuses. I'm going to give that shameless plug. Consider it for your syllabus. I don't feel bad about doing that shameless plug, because I know that if there's professors out there, at least some of you have written a $130 book and put it on your syllabus every semester for your students to buy. So I feel okay. Mine's only $17.99. I feel okay plugging it in that way. And the other challenging thing is when you are virtually in this way, no clue whether that joke landed or people started signing off after that. But these are the challenges of a virtual world. And of course, we know why we're virtual. We know why we can't gather in person. When I first talked to Robert about this event, it was going to be in person last summer. And now we are coming up on a tragic milestone of 500,000 dead from COVID-19 here in the US alone. And if we look back at now just about the last 20 years, we now have about 500,000 dead from overdoses that had an opioid involved. And we now know that the last 12 months that we have some sort of data for, provisional data at this point, we're looking at about 82,000 people dead in 12 months from drug overdoses. And of course, that doesn't include deaths from alcohol, that doesn't include deaths from cigarette smoking, that doesn't include a lot of other numbers that have to do with addiction. And so it would be possible, it would seem to make sense in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic to think about the opioid epidemic and to think about opioids as kind of a virus, a deadly virus spreading its death and destruction across the country, ravaging communities, and leaving people mourning lost loved ones. It would be easy to make that connection, but to think about Oxycontin being introduced as a minimally addictive pain medication in 1996, and then that mutating into the rise of heroin overdose deaths, and then another fatal mutation to the use of fentanyl, which kills even more people now every year. But I actually think there are some problems of making that analogy. And I don't think it works. And in fact, while I understand there are some natural connections there, it actually covers up more than it reveals. And to think about the opioid epidemic in that way can lead us to some wrong conclusions. Because if we think about opioids like we think about the coronavirus, that leads us to that fundamental position of wanting to be at war with the drug. I think a lot of you understand already, and we'll dive into more, that when there is a war declared on drugs, what we really end up with is a war declared on people. And the people who the war is declared upon are often the ones who have the least resources and ability to defend themselves. So there's a few other problems with that analogy. First, we've actually been in not just an opioid crisis, but an overdose crisis. And that overdose crisis started back in 1979. We can track every 9 years since then, we've actually seen overdoses double. And so now I'm the last person to want to excuse Purdue Pharma or any of these pharmaceutical companies that used illegal and immoral practices to talk about their pain medications. But this crisis started in 1979, not 1996. So while that certainly was a factor, there is something deeper at work. And it's also important to note that right now we have an overdose epidemic, but a coronavirus pandemic. And it's a pandemic because it's spread to other countries across the world. And while we have seen an uptick in overdoses in countries like Canada and some in the UK and other places, we have not seen anything in the world like we have here in the United States. This is a distinctly American problem. And we also know that unlike the virus, we don't see those negative effects simply because of the presence of the substance. Otherwise, we would see these same kind of problems in the countries where drugs like fentanyl or heroin are often produced. And we don't. And so when thinking about a pandemic or an epidemic, there's two primary frames that you can decide and different ways to approach it. Both are appropriate at different times. And I'd like to argue that for our current addiction epidemic, or our epidemic of overdoses, that the way that we should look at it is not about the pathogen. But the other way to look at it is, has there been anything in the population that has changed that makes that population more vulnerable to something that was already present within that population? Fentanyl is not a new drug. It was synthesized back in the 1960s, started being used more regularly here in the United States in medicine by 1968. Heroin is over 100 years old. Opium, there's evidence that humans might have been cultivating opium poppies before we even had alcohol. So this is a drug that has been with us. But we've now seen a spike in overdoses. And I think the question is not so much about the substance, but what about us? What about all of us? Jason was so right to say this is not about a moral failing on the parts of individuals, but I do want to make the case today that we do see a moral failing in our country, in our institutions, in our society, about how we've thought about addiction, about how we've thought about those who are addicted, and how we've treated people. And this is a moral failing that has roots going back a long time ago. And so to start this exploration with you all, I want to go back to Vietnam in the 1960s. So Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, that area has traditionally been a place where a lot of opium poppies were grown. And you'd have farmers who would often have water buffaloes, the cattle that would go out and tend the fields. Sometimes the poppies would be grown right alongside other staple crops. And farmers would note that, yes, sometimes that water buffalo, that oxen might munch on a few opium poppies, but never really had to worry about their crop. That was till a little bit later, when bombs started to fall in Vietnam. And farmers started to report that they were having trouble fencing their cattle, fencing their water buffalo out of those poppy fields. Because it seemed like once those bombs started to drop, there was nothing they could do to stop their cattle from grazing on those opium poppies. Now we know at the same time, we have American service members over in Vietnam, halfway across the world, away from their homes, away from their communities, in a new environment, in a cause that many of them weren't sure about. They were watching their friends die. They were watching bombs dropped around them. They were being killed. They were killing. And at the same time that they have these moments of trauma, danger, they'd have weeks where they had nothing to do. So one study estimated, it was done in 1974, that roughly 43% of U.S. service members, while over serving in Vietnam, tried some sort of narcotic, mostly heroin. And of that 43%, roughly half developed full-blown addictions. Now, the U.S. military knew this, and they started to try to provide treatment programs for the U.S. service members while over in Vietnam. And they had about a 5% success rate. 95% upon discharge went very quickly back to their previous drug usage. So the U.S. military was starting to sound the alarm. Headlines in the New York Times about a ticking time bomb of people coming back. At the same time, our country not doing what it needed to make sure that people had the treatment resources they needed. But these researchers that were looking at this returning population found something very interesting. In interviewing people on their, as they returned, and 10 months later, within 10 months, 95% of those who had been addicted while in Vietnam had stopped using heroin in the United States. And the final 5%, for the most part, were just going back to their previous level of drug use. And so, as we think about these environments, it's clear that these soldiers, they didn't fundamentally have a drug problem so much as they had a Vietnam problem, they had a violent trauma problem, and that they had found something to try to treat the trauma that they were experiencing. And so there's a researcher, Canadian researcher, Bruce Alexander, who took a look at this phenomenon. He wanted to understand it better, and he designed an experiment some of you might be familiar with. It's now famous and infamous, called Rat Park. And he realized that when most studies were being done about addiction on rats, they were always put in these tiny little Skinner boxes, all alone. And they were given their food, and they were given 2 water bottles, one normally laced with an addictive substance like cocaine or an opioid, and the other just a normal water bottle. And these researchers would time and time again watch these rats press that little lever to get more cocaine or to get more heroin-laced water, often to the neglect of food and eating, and would watch these rats sometimes kill themselves as they overdosed on the drug that was available to them. So Alexander, seeing that environment matters, decided to create a little rat park where rats, instead of being isolated in a cage, they were put together with their friends. They were put together with mates. They had wood chips to dig around with. They had little toys to play with. And while some of those rats did use the drugs as they became available to them in these tests, you never saw the same kind of effects that you would when you had those rats isolated. And so there's a question now in all of our minds. In knowing this effect of the environment, is in what ways do we think our lives today might be a lot more like those isolated Skinner boxes than we care to admit? And this has had huge implications over the course of our history, especially for various indigenous populations and other traditionally oppressed people. Look back at the Hudson Bay Company, at the time one of the largest companies in North America. It was set up to trap and hunt in the wilds of Canada. And when they were the Hudson Bay Company was setting up in Canada, they decided they wanted to hire mostly Orkney tribe members because they were known as being much more sober than their European counterparts. And so at one point, up to 76% of this Orkney tribe were employees of the Hudson Bay Company. And it didn't take too long, but within a few decades, this group that was known for their sobriety had near universal alcoholism across the tribe as they were pulled away from their traditional lands, as they were sent to isolated or remote outposts, pushed to not speak their language, pushed to not keep their traditions. All of these things were dislocating in a way that opened up the population to alcohol abuse in a way that was negative at a population-wide level. And we see this time and time again that most indigenous tribes that we now think of as having these inherent addiction problems, it didn't start with the introduction of the addictive substance. It started with people getting pushed off their lands. It started with people seeing their tribes killed, their customs destroyed, their language taken away from them. And this is where I think that we need to reformulate our understanding. The thought is so often of what is the gateway drug that is leading young people to use. And I think we need to stop thinking about a gateway drug and thinking about the gateway trauma that occurs in people's lives. The gateway of dislocation, being moved from what you know, from what you understand, from stable social structures, that these are environments in which addiction can thrive. And the second thing I want to take a look at is punishment. I don't think it's a coincidence that the United States has both the highest per capita prison rate, the largest prison population in the world, and we have the highest overdose rate. Addiction, by its very definition, is a self-harming behavior. It becomes an addiction when the negative consequences are outweighing any possible positive benefits. And to simply increase the amount of harm associated with a behavior of self-harm does not do any good, and in fact, it often makes things worse. There was a study done over the course of 12 years of 1,300 IV drug users in Baltimore. And what the researchers wanted to understand is what programs were they running that were most effective at helping people move into some sort of recovery. And at the end of this study, in only the way that an academic paper can read, the authors wrote, "Of great interest is that only a history of incarceration differentiated persons who successfully stopped using drugs from those who continue to use injection drugs over a 12-year period." Just to say that again, the only thing that they could conclusively say, this was not the purpose of the study, they wanted to look at programs. The only thing they could conclusively say from the data is that if you went to jail, if you went to prison, you were more likely to keep using than if you didn't. And that is because being locked in a cage is a traumatic experience. And the fact that we so often think that that will somehow be the answer to society's ills shows a deeply perverted way of understanding both humans and what it means to have a flourishing society. And we saw that in the 1980s, when there was the rise of the crack epidemic, we saw that crack as a virus that needed to be attacked. And instead of it just attacking the substance, we attacked people. The crack epidemic, we know that per capita cocaine usage peaked in the 1970s, not the 1980s. And yet that was when our incarceration rate went up, because what we saw was that crack affected a community that was already being oppressed, that was already being marginalized, that already had a lack of opportunity. that it was all of these things plus the drug that created what we saw. And our system of increasing punishment, our war, creating mass incarceration, actively fueled that problem, and it made it worse. And the other thing that it did is it left us unprepared for the rise of opioids. Because I think whether it was explicit or implicit, there was a belief that the whiteness of my skin was somehow a protection from addiction. That the problems that we saw in inner cities were race-based in the fact that there were others who were more susceptible to addiction than me as a good white person. And that lie, that racist lie, hurt Black communities immediately and directly in devastating ways. But to believe a lie about yourself will eventually often hurt you too. And I think that's what we saw of this lack of awareness, this lack of humility, of understanding that this could happen to anyone. This can happen in rural areas. This can happen in suburban areas. These are things that can affect and afflict us all. And this is where some of you probably know, especially if you're in Appalachia, the stories of the canaries in the old coal mines. The miners who would go down into the coal mine with a canary with a sensitive respiratory system. So if there are any noxious gases, any dangerous fumes, they would know that if that bird stopped singing, if that bird fell to the bottom of its cage, they didn't need to ask, what's wrong with the bird? Why isn't the bird keeping on singing? We're still working. They knew there was something dangerous in the environment that was about to hurt them as well. It was about to kill them as well. And I think too many times in our society, we've looked at the suffering of others and said, gee, I'm glad I'm not that bird. I wonder what's wrong. Instead of understanding that we're living in a system that, yes, there will be some people who feel it first, but those same injustices are hurting us all, and we need to address them. And so, as I was going through my research, of course, asked the question of, are there any other models? Is there anyone who has actually taken a public health approach to addiction? You look at the country of Portugal. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs and decided they were going to spend more money on treatment. They were going to spend more money on trying to reduce demand than they were going to stop supply. Now, experts across the world declared that this would be an immediate failure. You can't decriminalize all drugs. That would be chaos. People would come from across the world just to go to Portugal. And now we have the latest data for 2017. At the time that Portugal decriminalized all drugs, about 1% of their population were IV heroin users. And that is, even here in the United States today, we're at about 0.5%. So this was worse than what we have right now. The current overdose rates for 2017 in Portugal was 6 per million. The average in the EU was 21.3 per million. So one of the lowest overdose rates in the EU. When I first looked at these statistics, I got it wrong because I had recently seen that the US in 2017, the overdose rate was 21.7. But I forgot that the US now counts their overdoses per 100,000. So if you want the comparison, that is 6 per million in Portugal, 21.3 for the EU as a whole, and in the United States, that's 217. That's 2017 data. Our overdose rate has gone up significantly since then. So I think that this shows the lie of a myth of redemptive violence, that somehow creating additional violence and punishment for those who are already suffering is somehow going to solve this problem. And too often I feel like the measures that have already been taken, this is now more popular for politicians to say that the war on drugs has failed. It's now more popular for them to say that it is a public health crisis. But then when we've reformed criminal justice bills that previously had a 100-to-1 crack to cocaine disparity sentencing, where the biggest difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine is the skin color of the users and the people who are going to jail for it. We just went from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. So it was like listening to this song of racism on the radio and deciding to turn down the volume a bit instead of asking whether or not we should just change the channel. And well, that is a little bit more of the, I think, hard points. I also want to kind of take this final section with a little bit more hope and some of the positive developments that are happening. I hope you can be thinking about ways that this could affect your work and your university and college communities. And I want to tell the story of William Miller. He's a son of Appalachia. He was born and raised in Pennsylvania. And his dad was a miner, didn't go past 8th grade. Mother finished high school, worked in a factory. Miller never went west of the border of Pennsylvania until he left for graduate school to study psychology. There are a few interesting things about Miller's career that help you understand why he was uniquely positioned to end up being one of the people to revolutionize addiction studies and to develop motivational interviewing, one of the evidence-based ways that we see of effectively addressing addiction. The first internship he had in the middle of grad school, it doesn't sound like it was very well structured. He showed up not quite sure what he was going to do and was told that he was going to be working with men who had struggled with alcohol. He didn't have any alcohol problems in his family. He had not yet read any research about alcohol. And in reflecting back on this, he said one of the most significant things for his career was that nobody told me that these men I was about to work with were all supposed to be liars. Because the primary literature at the time understood alcoholism as a personality disorder, and it was those who were already deceptive, those who were immoral, those who wanted nothing more than the pleasure of drinking for their life that became susceptible to becoming alcoholics. But he had never read them. And so he said that the next thing that was important to understand about his career is that he went into that summer acknowledging that he didn't know much about alcohol or alcoholism. And so instead, he wanted to spend his summer listening. He wanted to hear the stories of those who had come to him and hear how they understood themselves and how they understood their relationship with alcohol and what it was that might make them want to change that relationship with alcohol. And that was where he could never believe the literature once he spent an entire summer simply listening to people describe their own story. The third thing that happened for Miller that was interesting was he is a hard-nosed science guy. He wanted numbers. He wanted to understand what was going on in people's heads. He was in the cognitive behavioral side of psychological studies. But his department, he was supposed to get a counseling class and learn some more of these counseling skills, even though that's not really what he wanted to do with his career. And they brought in somebody from the person-centered, client-centered therapy world of Carl Rogers and that tradition. So these two different streams of psychology for him suddenly met. And he started to identify and see some patterns that a lot of other researchers were missing because he had these unique experiences. One of the first things he wanted to do was he wanted to understand the effects of counseling on those struggling with alcohol, those with an alcohol use disorder. And so the first thing he did is he set up a comparison of people who had 5 weeks of counseling versus 25 weeks of counseling, and assuming there would be a significant difference. To his surprise, there was none. So he decided to put together a 10-week program versus someone getting a single time of sitting down with a counselor and being sent home with a self-help book about how to better look at their drinking. He didn't see any significant difference. So he decided to do an 18-week program versus the self-help book. Still no difference. So then he decided to set up a waitlist group, because maybe he thought it was the desire to sign up for the study that was the driver of the effects, and so he could tell that from having a group that went through the study and another group that was waitlisted and then went through the study afterwards. If any of you are researchers out there, I hope you're following me. But once again, he saw no significant difference between all of these different groups. For the waitlist group, they had signed up for the study but saw no change in their drinking until they then were later accepted into the study, and then they saw a similar change as to the first two groups. So we started looking at the other research. He looked at an ER study where he found that chaplains who went in for just a 20-minute empathetic talk for somebody who would come in because of alcohol, that those people were 10 times more likely to seek some sort of alcohol assistance after that 20-minute intervention, and dramatically more likely to be successful in that just from a 20-minute intervention. He found another study that was able to look at the tone of voice a doctor used when talking to a patient about their alcohol use, and found that the more judgmental the tone of voice, the less likely that person would be to seek help. He did another multi-site study with a variety of evidence-based approaches to addressing addiction to see which one was the best. And as the father of motivational interviewing, he was excited to see if his methodology would be the best. And after this large multi-site study, looking at thousands of people, they found no significant difference in outcomes between the different evidence-based methodologies, but a dramatic difference inside each methodology. And the primary driver was the empathy rating that was given to the counselor who was providing the support for the clients. And so Miller asked, what is it? What might frame this substantial observed effects of these interpersonal interactions? What do we know that is A, interpersonal, B, even in relatively small doses, can have a marked and sometimes profound effect, C, seems to work by decreasing negativity, and D, the more severe the problem, the larger the response? And he said, in medical ethics, it's called beneficence. In Buddhism, it's metta. In Judaism, it's hesed. In Islam, it's rahmah. And in Christianity, it's agape. There is something about the love that a person enters into that conversation. There is something about the love and compassion and empathy a person experiences that even this guy who wanted his career to be dedicated to hard-nosed science, he wanted data, he wanted the facts, could not ignore that this hard to define but deeply true and real experience of feeling loved is one of the most transformative powers in addiction treatment that we have. And he finished this peer-reviewed paper with a quote from the Catholic priest Teilhard de Chardin: "The day will come when, after harnessing space, the wind's gravitation, we shall harness for good the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire." So I got a chance to sit down with Bill Miller, and he helped me with a problem that I was having with my publisher. Because as I said, my story was one of early detection. I didn't have a downward spiral. I had been hospitalized for a mild case of pancreatitis, and when the doctors did a procedure to try to understand why I was 25 at the time, why I had pancreatitis, it was kind of odd. They did a procedure that hit my pancreas and set off a series of medical events where soon I was in the ICU. I was in acute respiratory distress. The doctors were calling my parents to come in and get ready to say goodbye to their son. And so, of course, they put me on heavy doses of narcotics, a pump of Dilaudid and patches of fentanyl. And as the months wore on, and I was eventually discharged and stabilized, my usage went from one of physical dependence to compulsive. Went to one where I was using off script much more than I should. And I had a doctor, a pancreatic specialist, sit down. And it was supposed to be a routine checkup. But he noticed that I was unable to move from the IV nutrition that I was getting every day to any kind of solid food. I was having a hard time even drinking water. He noted that that must be gastric paresis, a painful condition where the opioids I was taking were such a high level for so long and had started to deaden the nerve endings in my digestive system so that I couldn't start eating again. And so what had previously been saving me from pain was now causing pain. And I felt decreasing control over it. But over the course of my hospitalization, I had had multiple doctors and nurses confront me aggressively, telling me that I had just been faking my pain in order to get pain medicine. So I was in a defensive position. I was in a defensive posture. And he sat down with me and he said, Tim, you need to know you didn't do anything wrong, but I think you're addicted to pain medicine. And I had wanted to fight it. I had wanted to push back. But when he said you didn't do anything wrong, I also was able to let my guard down. He said, and Tim, I also want you to know that I believe that you're in pain. And to have that recognition, to have him see me, and to know that I was trying to address pain, and that it had then developed into something beyond my control, that I felt was beyond my control, made me feel seen. And then he asked, I was surprised, he asked me, Tim, what does a full life look like for you? And I described to him some of my hopes, some of my dreams, that I wanted to write a book. And he said, great. Do you imagine doing all of that while still on opioids? I said, no, I don't. And he said, great. We're on the same page. Let's achieve those goals together. I got to share this with William Miller, who just smiled knowingly. This doctor had taken a short course, a motivational interview. He wasn't an addiction expert, he wasn't an addiction counselor, but he knew how to start the conversation in a way that I could hear it. And it makes me wonder, what did he see in me that made him believe? Because he could have cut me off that day. In fact, he probably should have. He could have gotten in trouble. He should have, by most standards in most states, given me 5 days and then kicked me off. Let me wean down quickly, taper down, and then deal with it as an addiction problem. He gave me time and space to get counseling, alternative pain management, and here I am today, without a lot of the other negative effects. What was it, I wonder, that he saw in me? I don't know, that there are always functions of privilege. It helps to be in a professional class job. It helps to be white. It helps to have someone who felt they had a connection with me. There's a lot of different explanations, but there's one that I hope is true because I think it's an encouragement for all of us. There are 2 researchers, Leake and King, who went to 3 different alcohol recovery centers. They studied each patient that was being treated. And after they studied the histories, the backgrounds, and the files for every patient, they developed a list and they gave it to the counselors and leaders of these different treatment facilities. And they said, we're running a study. These are the people based on their background that we believe are most likely to recover. So the staff was very thankful, and the researchers kept checking in over the past few years. And sure enough, they were spot on over the course of the next few years. Every time they checked in, the people on their list were more likely to get sober and stay sober. If they had a relapse, it was shorter and less severe. So everyone wanted to know, what did you figure out that allowed you to so accurately predict who was going to move into recovery and who wasn't? The answer was this: nothing. They had randomly assigned all of those people to that list. The only thing that had changed, the only thing that was different, was the expectations of the staff and the counselors. They believed these were the people who were going to recover, and they were more likely to recover because of it. And so our lives have been turned upside down by this pandemic. A lot of the things that we thought just simply had to be the way they were have changed, some for the better and some for worse. But it's also evidence that when there's the will, we can make dramatic changes. There are ways that we don't have to accept our status quo. There are ways that we can make changes. There are ways that we can reimagine our institutions, our churches, our schools, our universities, to be that kind of place that removes stigma, and to be that kind of place that believes everyone can enter into some kind of recovery. Everyone can enter into a better place where they don't need to see the destructive nature of these drugs in their lives, because so much of what we think about as being destructive from the drug is actually destructive from how we treat people who are struggling with addiction. And so I hope that throughout the rest of this conference, you all get to imagine together what it might look like to have people from different departments all thinking about and talking about addiction together. Both because I think there's more innovations that need to come, better and deeper understanding, but also because I believe simply having that conversation, simply having it be okay to ask about your substance use, to ask before it gets too bad, to be able to have open conversations about these things now can and will make an effect. And I hope that each of you thinks from your professional capacity, what can you do to be a part of this? But also from that personal capacity, that moment where someone might come to you for the first time, needing to hear something, ready to say something that they might not have otherwise. And that you will be ready to be that person of love and of empathy. Because it made all the difference in my life for a pancreatic specialist to slow down his day and to ask me what I wanted to achieve. And I know that each of you could be that for another. So thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to continuing this dialogue and having some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And so I wonder now if there are some questions. We're going to consult the chat room to see. One of the questions is this, and Dr. Oliver Morgan, who's actually just recently written a book himself, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We'll put out an advertisement for that. He said this. He asked this: "You're one of the success stories of motivational interviewing. Listening and affirming people is an important way to proceed. How do you marry this idea to an earlier idea about social environmental factors in addiction?"
Yeah, one of the interesting things with motivational interviewing in particular is it works well, and it also works well with with other kinds of treatment. It's not a standalone, and it is something that I think especially if I do any work with pastors or churches, it's one of the areas where it's like, this is just going to help your life. I just was talking to a friend of mine whose wife went through a motivational interviewing training. He's like, it's changed the way we fight and the way we relate in a fantastic way. So just transformational for a relationship. But one of the things that I think motivational interviewing gets at is helping people understand the positive motivations that they might have had for their drug or substance use, right? So instead of starting with this, like, because motivational interviewing is about listening and understanding motivation and understanding that people's ambivalence, right? The ambivalence piece is when you focus on the negative, the person wants to defend the negative. But the hard thing to talk about is the fact that drug use has some positive benefits, and that's why it's so hard to get at. If it all was bad, it would be much easier to deal with. But the reality, like for me, one thing that I think why I went from a simple dependence, right? Because I'd actually been on opioids multiple different times in my life for different surgeries, sports injuries. I had this initial pancreas issue and was on opioids for almost 2 months and then went off of them before I had the secondary issue. Part of why I think that happened for me was I was in the ICU and I'm worried about dying. And opioids in particular, one of the reasons why they're so powerful is that they mimic our endorphins, right? The endorphins, this molecule of emotion. It's what makes us feel a sense of warmth or intimacy with a partner or with a child. And in fact, the word endorphin is the combination of the two words endogenous and morphine, right? So the researcher who discovered endorphins was like, oh yeah, this is basically the body's version of morphine. And so with motivational interviewing for me, that kind of curiosity allowed me to acknowledge, yeah, I get it. That makes sense of why this had been so important to me. It not only relieved pain, it made me relieve my anxiety. And when I felt isolated in an ICU at 2 o'clock in the morning, it would make me feel comforted. And those sorts of positive effects, I think, if you're talking with someone about methamphetamine use, one of the common things I've heard from others who use a methamphetamine is that early on, it was something that helped them feel like they were able to think more clearly and that they were able to focus and accomplish more. Or for people who have felt a sense of being dispossessed or not being powerful, it makes them feel powerful. So when we look at these environmental factors, I think motivational interviewing is the great way to help someone do that self-reflection of what are those positive reasons, acknowledge them, but then also help them draw out that ambivalence in a way that can motivate change.
Great, thank you. We have a question from one of our panelists. Kate wanted to ask a question, so I want to make space so she can do that.
All right, thank you. This is so interesting, Mr. King, and I understand that you've actually worked with some of my colleagues in New Hampshire, so I'll be interested to talk to you more about that later. But I was wondering, you mentioned something that I didn't quite follow about an issue with your publisher. And I might have heard this wrong, but I thought that you were suggesting that because you hadn't kind of, hit what people might call a rock bottom, that maybe that wasn't seen in the context that, this is an addiction story. And this is something I've actually been very interested in, where it does seem like most of the books about addiction, the memoirs and so on, have this particular shape where, people hit rock bottom and then they find recovery, and, it's very familiar. So I guess I'm just curious, like, was this your experience that there wasn't as much of an appetite for a story that didn't fall into that mold?
Yeah, I don't think I came back to the publisher part. So there were a few pieces, like partly how I had pitched the book is like, hey, hopefully this is relatable to people in a way, because I didn't hit rock bottom. One of the early chapters I talk about our desire, like the deep desire to be like not me, right? To see those images of addiction that Jason was talking about. And we're like, that's not me. That's not me. I'm okay. So there is that desire of having those more dramatic stories, and so many people, because they're dramatic, they tell well, and so that becomes the idea that people have in their head. So my publisher going in knew that, and I think they were a little bit like, "Don't you have any other good stories, like a little more spice?" The other thing, and I don't think I completed this thought, was that. The other thing was the publisher wanted more anecdotes about important milestones in my recovery. They were like, well, what else happened? Weren't there lots of these sorts of things? And in my mind, there were, but in my mind, nothing stuck out like that short conversation with that one doctor in the doctor's office. And that was where, Miller's research had confirmed that, yeah, that happens a lot. There is a catalyzing moment for a lot of people. There is that, Saul to Paul. There is Jean Valjean and the priest in Les Mis, like those dramatic turnings. But sometimes they come in a lot of smaller, different forms. And that was where the publisher wanted more of those kind of stories. And it's like, this is the one I have. And I told Bill Miller this, and he was just like, yeah, that makes sense. That's very common to have that one moment stick out in your mind. And, people often need those other additional supports, and that's not unimportant, but it's great to have along the way. And the one other interesting thing that I will say along that of people's mindsets of, no one wants to be an alcoholic, right? Because that sounds like this line that you either are or you aren't, or in fact, addiction is normally progressive, right? Most people, part of the problem is you can have a young adult in college who starts binge drinking on the weekends, and then they get their first job and they're going out to happy hour with friends, and suddenly, 3 drinks a night throughout your 20s is 6 drinks a night in your 30s. It's 8 to 10 drinks a night in your 40s, and then you have a divorce, you lose your job, you have some sort of traumatic event, and it's a spiral down. So when I wrote a book about addiction, pretty much any of my friends who I would talk to about it who weren't in recovery would normally say something like, "Oh, I know that's an important topic out there." And I recently started the process of putting together a book proposal that I want to just call A Guide to Drug Use. And now anyone who I say that to, they're like, "Oh, I'd love to read that. I would want to read it." No one wants to think about the negative effects, but we all have relationships with psychoactive substances, even if it's just caffeine or chocolate. Forget that cocoa is a psychoactive substance, right? We all have relationships with these substances. Fewer people want to talk about it when it's addiction, but when you just let's just talk about your relationship to substance use. I found a lot more people are saying to me, "I want to read that book," when they wouldn't want to read a book about addiction, because that's something else.
I wonder if there are any other questions that our community has today. Feel free to use the question and answer aspect of our webinar to ask questions. Anything else? Well, I really think for me, a takeaway is just the incredible power of empathy in humanizing your journey that really has stood out to me. And I just really appreciate you sharing that. And I think that there's been a lot of excitement about this possibility of another book that you just mentioned. But a question has just come in about how might colleges and universities contribute to changing the narrative in society about addiction?
Yeah, one thing, as I was thinking about addiction in higher education, my alma mater was North Park University, and at the time there was the freshman dialogue class, which each year would take on an important topic and have a variety of professors from different disciplines all examine the same topic from different directions. And I think that one of the exciting opportunities in a higher ed situation is, right, like you can talk about biology, what's happening biologically in the midst of addiction, what's happening on a chemistry level, what is fentanyl, what is carfentanil, diving into the scary history of the fact that IV morphine was thought to be the cure for addiction, because at the time the idea was that you could only develop like a morphine habit, as it was called at the time, because it was orally ingested, and wine and alcohol was orally ingested, and so that intravenous injections would bypass the appetite system and get rid of addiction. There's a great history lesson of that kind of framework of other medical understandings. There's economics. The fact that one of the things that's required for an efficient drug distribution system is a lot of income inequality, where there's people ready to take huge risks to sell drugs because of the economic opportunity afforded. And that's normally when you don't have another job. If you can make $50,000 or $60,000 a year without risking going to jail, but you can make $80,000 or $90,000, those are the kind of payoffs. At what point do we actually have economic incentives, or the fact that we have corn farmers in Mexico who started growing opium poppies? That was as a result of trade deals. So there's a great political angle. Or the fact that the Contras were involved in bringing drugs to the United States. So you had Nancy Reagan saying, "Just say no," and the CIA working with the Contras and turning a blind eye to drugs being smuggled back into the US. That was one of the things that I had heard previously and I thought was completely made up, until I dug into it and realized, oh, yes. These stories about the CIA, whether it was American Air helping with heroin shipments to stop the spread of communism from China, to the Contras We have had governmental involvement in the drug trade in some very troubling ways, while at the same time declaring war on drugs. And so I think all of these different threads are a great way to help people understand the expansive nature of addiction, how it touches a lot of different parts of our society. And I think university campuses can be that hotbed, that kind of catalyzing agent for those sorts of conversations, so that you're sending people out into a variety of disciplines who all have that view and have that perspective. And at the same time, there's still so much research to be done. One thing I think of this often in religious terms. This kind of the difference between what I see as a common theology in the U.S. versus a more Franciscan Christian understanding. One of the common ideas is that there is this universal problem, addiction, and there must be one universal solution. And for some people, that has been kind of an AA higher power understanding. Now, I do think AA is very beneficial for a lot of people, an important social support system. There's some people it doesn't work for. There's some people who the higher power language is never going to connect with them. And so we need a lot more alternatives. There's not a universal solution to a universal problem. There are the particulars, right? Each person's story of addiction is specific. Each person's story of addiction involves their own personal traumas, their own personal environment that they're in. And we need to be able to address that. And just like we don't, cancer researchers no longer say they're just going to come up with a cure for all cancers, right? We're trying to cure specific cancers. We're trying to be very focused in our therapies. And I think the more that we can have that kind of research and understanding about, great, in what situations and for who is AA most effective? Where is MAT most needed? Where is smart recovery best? Where is motivational interviewing best? Where is cognitive behavioral therapy based? When do we need a cocktail of these different approaches? When do we need outpatient recovery support? When do we need inpatient recovery support? These are not universal fixes. And right now it's too often throwing people into anything they can get because people are desperate to get any kind of help. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah, that's the holistic force of a university in all those different areas that can strategically start addressing the issue of addiction. That's such a great vision of of addiction support. So we really appreciate your time. There's one last question about trauma-informed care and how to treat people where they're at. Any thoughts about? I know you talked about gateway trauma, right? But is there any thoughts you have about in trauma-informed care?
And this is, I think I hope there will be people throughout the time who are better positioned to speak, because I'm not a care practitioner, so I can speak to what I know, but this is certainly something that I'm excited to learn more about, and I hope gets to continue to be covered throughout the day. And so to make sure everyone kind of understands, one of the big things that's clear is with the ACE scale, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. For every point that you have on the ACE scale, I think one study had the likelihood of developing an addiction to a prescription pain medicine went up 43%. So we could see the huge role that childhood trauma especially plays in this. And the trauma-informed care that I have started looking at goes to some of that question of diversity of care too, because remember, Bill Wilson came from a banking background, right? He was a white guy on top of the world, but coming from a banking background, and came to a place where alcohol was taking over his life. And for him, one of the most important core lessons was this idea of admitting powerlessness, right? That was a transformative idea for him. And that might not be for everyone. And especially talking to people who have come through deep trauma or abuse, some people might need to hear that they are powerful. that they have agents, and that might be something that is an important ingredient in what it looks like for them to recover. And that's also going to continue to push the importance of counselors understanding or having training in the wide variety of pathways that can bring people to a place of addiction, and especially especially the fact that, so this, sorry, going back to thinking about the empathy studies, there were some follow-up empathy studies that showed that a lot of the effect on empathy, it wasn't so much that a counselor who got a 9 rating on the empathy scale was better than a counselor that got an 8 rating. It was the counselors who had really low ratings that were, sometimes it was worse going to a counselor who wasn't empathetic than to just not do anything. And so there's those paths of needing people to understand that trauma, to make sure too that the counselors or the staff that are providing that support don't lose their sense of empathy. So I think there is that understanding how trauma might inform what the client is dealing with, and more we're needing to also understand how the trauma that a fireman or someone from the fire department or an EMT, the kinds of trauma they might be experiencing, in a way that if they are treating people poorly and meeting them at one of their worst moments of waking up after being Narcan, that's a whole other level of trauma that is now feeding on that system. We've got somebody who's traumatized, further traumatizing someone who's been using to address their trauma.